Hello everyone, it's Miss Levy and we are here to learn about 7.1, so Chapter 7, Key Issue 1, which is the first key issue in our Political Geography unit. And this key issue is really about the differences between ethnicity and race, and where we see the ethnicities distributed within the United States, some difficulties with defining both ethnicity and race. Now, defining ethnicity and race are very important for the upcoming key issues, because we will learn about how ethnicity then translates to this idea of the nation state, and how issues with ethnic conflicts and even racism have led to conflicts, especially with the pursuit of the nation state, which we will talk much about in 7.3 and 7.4. So 7.1, we're defining ethnicity and race and where we see the distributions of ethnicities and races. 7.2, we will learn about how those translate to the idea of a nation and a state, a nation state, a multi-ethnic state, and a multinational state. And then in 7.3 and 7.4, we will learn about how all these ideas then can lead to conflict, especially when whenever it is in pursuit of this idea of the nation state. So let's take a look at the differences between ethnicity and race. Let's start with ethnicity. So ethnicity, this is identification with a common cultural group who have ties to a common homeland and shared history. It's typically the homeland of the ancestors. So ethnicity tends to be identification with culture. Typically it's the culture of the history of your people. So this could be somebody who's German, somebody who's Italian, can be Japanese, Hispanic, Cuban, Kenyan, American. And a person can be more than one ethnicity at the same time. So, for example, I know that I use myself as an example in class. Half of my family, they originate in Ireland, and the other half of my family originates in Germany. So my ethnicity is Irish-German. Now, when we look at race, race is biological, it's more physiological, it's genetic, it has to do with one's DNA. So race is identity with a group with a common ancestor of the same biology. Typically, race isn't a choice. It is, it's biological, it's the DNA, so we're the origin of your ancestors, and from this origin has emerged physiological and biological genetic elements. So again, ethnicity is more cultural identity of the homeland of your ancestors, and race is more of the biological, the genetic definitions. So the difference between the two, ethnicity is cultural ties and race is biological and physiological. And when we look at this question in 1D, which is race an element of ethnicity? And keeping in mind, as I'm going over this, this is the assignment that we did in class on 7.1, so please have yours out, making sure that you're reviewing your answers with my own. So again, back to 1D, is race an element of ethnicity? No, race is not an element of ethnicity. Race really is not an element of culture either. People can be of the same ethnicity and be of different races. So a person could identify as German but be white or black. A person can be of the same race but be of different ethnicities. Many people who are, anybody who is of European origin, most people who are Aryan as well, so these would be people Persian, many people who are identified as Arabs as an ethnicity, these would be people who would racially be defined as white. So somebody could be both, you could have somebody who's Spanish ethnicity, somebody's American ethnicity, somebody who's Brazilian ethnicity, somebody who's Portuguese, somebody who's Italian, somebody who's Persian. And each of those people is of the same race, and that would be white. So again, no, race is not an element of ethnicity. Race is really not an element of culture. When we look at our main ethnic groups here in the United States, there are 4 major ethnic groups in the United States. And they have different regional concentrations for various reasons. The largest ethnic group in the United States now is Hispanic or Latino or Latina, with 15% of our population. It's a heavy concentration of Hispanic in the southwestern part of the United States. This is mainly because of the proximity from their country of origin. And remember, the country that has been the largest senders of migrants to the United States in all of our history is Mexico. So it makes sense that people migrating from Mexico, they would be in the southwestern part of the United States, heavily concentrated there. Same with Central and South America. Then 13% of the population is African American. And again, this is where it becomes very difficult because they are defining them as also an ethnic group, African American, which is deceiving because that's oversimplification of this idea of African American. Because if a person is of the African American race, meaning they trace their ancestors back to a country in Africa or the continent of Africa, a person could be of the Kenyan ethnicity, be African American, but the Kenyan aspect is the more specific ethnicity. Anyway, they are 13% of the population. We see this heavily concentrated in the South, Southeast, and the northern cities. So many in the Southeast because of where they were originally forced to migrate to, from Africa to plantations to work on plantations in the South. Next, we have Asian Americans, 4% of our population, mainly concentrated in the west coast of the United States. We talked about in Unit 2 that Asian Americans have successfully, over the years, used the concept of chain migration. So it makes sense that if they were leaving Asia and they traveled to the United States, that they would settle there in the west coast proximity, but also this idea of chain migration. Finally, we have Native Americans, who are 1% of the population. Many are concentrated in the plains states, so this would be like Wyoming, Colorado, even in places like northern Arizona, Utah, Montana, and then in Alaska. So many are concentrated in the plains states because of the forced migration of the Native Americans to reservations. Next, let's look at this question in 2B, from where are the major Hispanic groups in the United States. 2/3 are from Mexico, and then many have originated from Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Central and South America. But again, we talked about the country who have been the largest senders of migrants in the history of the United States is Mexico. When we look at the major Asian groups in the United States of origin, 1/4 of the people are from Chinese descent. Then 1/5 are Indian, 1/5 are Filipino, 1/10 are Korean, and 1/10 are Vietnamese. Let's take a look at the cause-effect, the major historical migration patterns of African Americans. We could argue that this is also the scale of migration for African Americans. So it's really been 3 phases: migration from Africa, migration to the north, and migration within cities. So on the international scale, you have migration from Africa. This was the forced migration to the United States from Africa. During the time of slavery, they were brought to work on plantations in the South. Then interregional migration scale would be from migration from the plantations in the South and areas in the South to work in factories and cities in the North. Many people left because there was no opportunity for them in the South. They escaped discrimination and segregation and racism. And finally, on the intra-regional scale, 3rd phase would be migration within cities. This was in cities in the north. They were forced into particular neighborhoods, what we call ghettoization. So again, 3 main phases, 3 main scales: international from Africa to the United States, interregional from plantations or regions in the south to work in cities in the north, and then intra-regional would be within those cities in the north, forced into particular neighborhoods, ghettos, this concept called ghettoization. Let's take a look at this question 4 in terms of the concept of race. A, what is the problem with the way the U.S. Census Bureau defines Asian? It is an oversimplification of the diversity of people within Asia. So there are people from many countries in Asia, and they're very diverse in both race and ethnicity. So to categorize them as one overall blanket group of Asian really marginalizes the very diversity of the people within Asia. And then when we look at the difference between African American and Black, Okay, so African Americans are black, black race, but their origin traces back to Africa. Black can be African Americans, but it can also be people who have origin in other areas, including Latin America, Asia, and Latin America, Asia, and this should say the Caribbean. I apologize for that. Latin America, Asia, and also Pacific Islands. Next, how does the United States Census Bureau consider historic Latino? It is an ethnicity, not a race. For race, most Hispanics, Latinos would be white, black, or other. This is why it's very confusing when people try to define Hispanics as a race. This is sometimes at the root of this idea of racism, which we're going to talk about in the next question, is people who want to use this ideal or this argument of racial superiority over others without realizing they're of the same race. Next is racism. This is the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So again, this is this idea of racial superiority and then discriminating against others whom one views as of an inferior race. Oftentimes, whenever we look at trying to define race and the origin of race, this then does tend to create or lend itself to these ideas of racism. So let's look at the categories of race as defined by the United States Census Bureau and the origin of the people. So white is a race. People who are of European descent would be considered white. But it's also people who are Aryan, so people Persian, some people who are in India, some people who are Arab. They would be considered defined as also white because they're of the Aryan group. So European descent, and then some areas in Central and South and Southwest Asia. Next would be black or African American. This could be that people trace their origins to Africa. Could be Latin America, could be some parts of Asia, could be some of the Pacific Islands, or in islands in Africa. Next would be American Indian or Alaska Native. This would be America's indigenous people. So this could be both North and South America, the indigenous people. And then also in Alaska. Canada has also a very large indigenous population. Next would be Asian Indian. These would be people from India, Chinese, China, Filipino, Philippines, Japanese, Japan, Korean, North and South Korea. Korean is one nation, but two countries, two states. Vietnamese. This is Vietnam. Apologize for that spelling there. This would be Vietnam. Next is Other Asia, which would be other countries and indigenous groups who are around Asia. There are many different islands and such that are in Asia. And then there are lots of smaller races, indigenous people who are also in Asia. Next would be Native Hawaiian, which would be Hawaii. Guamanian would be people from Guam. Samoan would be people from the islands of Samoa. And then other Pacific Islander would be people from other Pacific islands, the smaller ones like Fiji or Papua New Guinea or Vanuatu. And then other race would be anyone who does not identify with the above or is mixed race. Next, let's take a look at some different concepts as part of this geography of race. So first would be separate but equal. These are the Jim Crow laws and segregation in the United States and the South. This idea of white flight, which was the unfair real estate practices, especially blockbusting, which was when real estate agents convinced people in white neighborhoods that minorities were planning to move to the neighborhood and that they must sell their house as soon as possible, often for a lower price. That was the point, was to get them sell it for a lower price, and then real estate agents would then turn around and sell the house for a larger profit. This is now illegal in the Fair Housing Act. Let's take a look at this idea of apartheid. Apartheid was the separation of races in South Africa. So this was segregation in South Africa. They literally defined people by their race, black, white, colored, which was mixed, or Asian. And each race had a different legal status. and it determined where somebody could live, where somebody could